Welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please leave a rate and review. Today, we will be taking a look at the Tulsa Golden Hurricanes, who finished 4-8 last season. They wrapped up their 2024 spring practice with what we'll call a spring showcase on April 6th. We have a special guest joining us today. He is the sports director for KJRH-TV, the NBC affiliate in Tulsa, and he's been covering Tulsa sports for over 16 years. He is Caden McFarland. Caden can be found at Caden MC on X. Welcome to the show, Caden.
Luke, thanks so much for having me. In addition to doing the sportscast, of course, I do a little bit of editing, so I can appreciate what you guys just threw together there with some old school TU highlights and Zaven Collins. I think I saw Steve Largent in there. Well done, fellas. I appreciate it.
That's all justice.
Thank you.
Well, let's tell us a little bit about yourself. What led you into television, sports, and covering Tulsa Golden Hurricanes for now over 16 years?
Yeah, it's been so long now. As a kid, I still have almost no discernible skills outside of what it takes to talk sports, sadly. And I think I realized that at an early age. It seemed like a job that would suit me, and so I just went that direction as soon as I could. I grew up in the Albuquerque area and went to the University of New Mexico, so a level very comparable to TU. But my mother was born here. My grandparents lived here in Tulsa, so we visited, a lot in the summer. And my first TV job, at least in sports, was in Abilene, Texas. I loved covering high school football there, but college football, even though I grew up in New Mexico, which is a wasteland for college football for the most part. Don't want to offend the Lobos or Aggies, but I loved it and just was bitten by the bug, and lifelong Notre Dame football fan, and still live and die with every game and listen to every single podcast. And so I wanted to get somewhere where I could cover college football, and the state of Oklahoma, the city of Tulsa, is a great place. We have now OU going to the SEC, which is exciting for everybody here, and OSU in the Big 12, which continues to be the Mike Gundy era, a high water mark there in Stillwater. But then we love here in the city of Tulsa being able to cover the University of Tulsa Golden Hurricane as well, because it is different. It's a different flavor. That's not the same level, obviously, as OU or OSU, but they have a rich history. And they go like this, right? I mean, Tulsa, as much as maybe any program in the G5 or anybody in the country, can be at 11 wins one year and 2 or 3 wins within a couple of years. It's an interesting program to cover, if nothing else, being the smallest school in Division I, having to constantly fight uphill. But they certainly take a lot of pride in the history of the program and attempting to stay there, at a level where, people maybe are talking about them a little bit, at least at the G5 level. So it's happened in the not too distant past. And hopefully for Kevin Wilson, it'll happen here again in the not too distant future.
Well, let's get to the position where it all starts on offense, and that is the quarterback. Last year, Braylon Braxton started game 1 of the Kevin Wilson era, but threw two interceptions in his first 4 attempts before leaving with an ankle injury. In comes redshirt freshman Cardell Williams. He ends up throwing for 3 TDs and running for another. Later on, he ends up hurting his shoulder in a 33-26 overtime loss to Charlotte. Then we got to see Kirk Francis for the next 3.5 games. With Braylon Braxton transferring to Marshall, how did the quarterback room look this spring?
So Cardell has been nursing a shoulder injury, and there were a couple things he was able to do during the spring, but we didn't see him in any of the scrimmage portions. So you had 2 local kids and 2 former walk-ons. Stephen Kittleman, back up from Jenks, Oklahoma, still a walk-on. Kirk Francis has now been put on scholarship, and really he gave the team at the end of last season the most consistent quarterback play they got from anybody all year long. None of us, even having watched his really prolific career at Metro Christian here in Tulsa, none of us expected that from him, certainly this soon. I mean, frankly, anytime a walk-on quarterback, a local walk-on comes on, you're just hoping that he makes an impact of any kind at any point, over the course of 4 years. To see the guy starting games in year 1 is pretty wild. It speaks to the fact that, one, he's got 2 things going for him. He's a pretty accurate passer, and I think that he processes things pretty well. He came up in a high school program where they throw the ball a ton. I think he understands the concepts, knows where, his eyes need to be, and he was ready to go when his number was called, and it maybe didn't play a better game than the Tulane ball game, where he throws for 345 yards against a really good defense. They were missing some key people, but TU's offense performed much better than expected on that day. And then the rest of the way, they were relatively consistent in their ability to move the ball and at least score some points. So Kirk Francis was the guy throughout spring, without question, took all of the number one reps. I think he's improved some. He's on the small side, as you might expect from a walk-on, but I think the arm strength, even in just the few weeks of the offseason and into spring, I think I saw some improvement there. He remains a guy who's pretty accurate and I think is awfully reliable. Cardell certainly, I think, gives you a higher ceiling, and when he was good, he was really good last season, but so much of the time he looked like a freshman quarterback, and his eyes were about that big at different times. And granted, not everything was perfect around him, and the position was just a bit of a mess from the start. You mentioned Braylon and the injury, and we all had anointed him as QB1, and he did have a lot of those leadership qualities and the body of work. Playing 4 or 5 games in 2022 was pretty good. Certainly, it looked like a guy who was able to give you the run and pass element, and had great size and good leadership qualities. And so we all assumed he was going to be the guy. And when he's done in the first series and never is able to get back and show anything like what he had in 2022, they ended up starting Roman Fuller for a game, and I think he threw 5 interceptions against Oklahoma. They started Cardell, they started Kirk. So to start 4 different quarterbacks, it's such a far cry from what Kevin Wilson had gotten used to, right? With Justin Fields, and some of the best quarterbacks that not only have played in college football, but now at the next level, some of the very best guys. And so, not what he was expecting, no question. He made the best of what he could with that hand. And as we go forward here, they've just brought in a transfer from Utah State who started, I believe, 15 games, Cooper Lega, who threw, I think, 18 or 19 touchdown passes last year. So that's a guy who I think immediately is going to be in the mix as a starter. Kevin Wilson has said multiple times, look, we're a 4-18. Nobody is the anointed QB1 here at this moment. You're going to have to fight for this. And so I like Kirk Francis's chances because he knows the offense better probably than anybody around him. He's got that accuracy. I think the ability to make decisions and process is good. I also like Cardell's chances because I happen to think his ceiling is probably higher than the 3 guys we're talking about. And just based on his track record, I think Lega has a shot. So point being, I've talked for a while now. I have no idea who's going to roll out as the starter for week 1 in August. It's completely up in the air, and I think that's not a bad thing based on what happened last year. These guys should need to respond to competition in a good way, and so we'll see. We'll see who emerges from that fire refined the most.
Can you tell us a little bit about how Cardell's shoulder injury recovery is coming along?
Everything I've heard is that it was on schedule, and the fact that he was able to do some things in the spring was a really good sign. So I assume he's good to go. When he's right, and gosh, he was just so skinny, but when he's right, he's a guy that gives you everything you want in terms of, he wants to throw the ball down the field, has a pretty strong arm. When he's on, he's incredibly accurate. Against Pine Bluff, I think maybe threw 1 incomplete pass, and then there were a game or 2 down the line where when he was on, he doesn't miss. When he's off, he misses a whole lot. And so obviously he needs to become a much more consistent passer for this to be his job. But he's got the talent that if he is able to bring it together, you would feel really good about Cardell Williams being QB1 at TU. And then Lega, a guy that was brought in, just really a few days ago, a couple weeks ago. I'm very interested to see what the buzz is about this guy. Like, is this a guy that they brought in thinking he's likely to win this job? Or is this a guy that you brought in just kind of hoping? I'll be interested to see.
What can you tell us about freshman quarterback Tim Carpenter?
He is, according to the recruiting services, probably the number 1 recruit in this class of 2024, which was the best that TU assigned in, let's call it the Rivals or 24/7 or On3 era. Since people started tracking recruiting like this on the internet, this is the best class they've signed. We can talk about the reasons for that a little bit later, but Kevin Wilson and his staff really went to work. And, he's kind of a mid to high 3-star prospect, which TU doesn't get very many of those guys, who had been committed to Indiana, so a Big Ten school from the Dayton, Ohio area. Big kid, I think 6'3" or 6'4", good size. I think probably a little bit raw, but, when I talk about Cardell having the highest ceiling, I'm talking about those top 3 guys that have some experience. Carpenter might have the highest ceiling of anybody in that room. And so you wouldn't necessarily want to count him out, right? If he's the guy who can go out there, especially with an offensive line that's got some moving parts, if you need a quarterback to make plays, he might be the guy to do that with his legs, and his arm. So the buzz is good, but I think Kevin Wilson would like to go with a quarterback with more experience for the time being.
So let's talk about the running game. The Hurricanes lose Jordan Ford, but bring back their top 2 rushers from 2023, and Anthony Watkins and Bill Jackson. How did that room look this spring?
It looks good because, Watkins and Jackson were both in the mix and played in that spring showcase. Both made a couple of plays. Jackson especially got loose for a couple of nice ones. Both of those guys had good moments down the stretch. Watkins especially, he was in the doghouse. 2 years ago, he missed, the 2022 season because of academics, I believe. 2021, he averaged like 7.4 yards per carry, and he was the better running back between Watkins and Deneric Prince, who is still on the Kansas City Chiefs roster, I believe practice squad, but, vying for a spot, on that great Kansas City Chiefs offense. And so Watkins was a guy who I thought would be unquestionably the number 1 option at running back. And for whatever reason, he seemed to sort of be in the doghouse. And I don't know exactly what that was to start the year, but he was not the starter. He was kind of getting 3rd-team reps, but then it became it was hit and miss, against Northern Illinois, which was early in the year, a good win for them on the road. They really leaned on him, but it was those final 4 games where I think, he picked up more than 400 yards rushing in those final 4 games, where you really started to see him, I think, understand what Kevin Wilson wanted of him, and showcase some of that talent. He was recruited initially by Missouri and transferred into Tulsa after being in Columbia for a year or 2. And he's got the size and speed that you want. Like he's a big back, or, pretty sturdy, but certainly a guy who can break away. And so to me, he's the most talented guy in the room. And if his head is screwed on straight, he can give you some really good running back play, nearly 1,000 yards last year, even though, his playing time was hit and miss. But I really like Jackson as well as a nice compliment, a little bit smaller back, but a guy who hits the hole fast, and a couple of times in the spring showcase got loose. Did fumble once. You never want to see that, but I like that combo. And if you're just talking position groups, that is probably one of the stronger ones. And one of the guys that they have Taj Gary as well, who transferred in, I believe, from Virginia Tech years ago. But there was a guy who really popped, Byron Ellison Jr., I believe, out of Lewisville, Texas, true freshman who came in early. And he's probably the guy with maybe even more juice than Watkins. A slippery guy, good speed and burst, showed on a screen pass a time or 2, and then also going through the hole. Wouldn't be a bit surprised if Ellison Jr. Makes his name known and his presence felt early on here. And they bring in some good running backs in the freshman class, but he certainly got my attention this spring.
What kind of split do you think we kind of see from this team in 2024? If you're talking about Ellison Jr. maybe popping on. Last year, the backfield was pretty much dominated by Watkins, even though he kind of came on late. He had about 100 more attempts than second leading rusher Bill Jackson.
Yeah, I think it'll be pretty close to that, where Watkins is kind of clearly the number 1 option, but Jackson sees plenty of time as well. And then what's left, depending upon how it goes, and that's not just with Ellison Jr., but any of those freshmen who come in, if they prove themselves capable, they're able to pass protect, obviously, for one, but then prove themselves capable of carrying out a role. I could see it expanding for any of those guys because Kevin Wilson is a guy who's going to play the best. The previous head coach, Philip Montgomery, seemed like a head coach who tended to be more loyal, and he had his guys that he loved. He kind of loved all of his players, but if you had put in the time for him, he was going to give you every last opportunity to prove yourself on Saturdays. Kevin Wilson, to me, just like we saw with, playing 4 quarterbacks last year, that wasn't all because of injury. And Watkins starting as the 3rd string guy and then becoming the guy who nearly runs for 1,000 yards. He'll change it, really quickly. And being a first-year coach is part of that too. He wasn't beholden necessarily to anybody that was on the roster. It was kind of a prove it to me thing. And I think if some of those talented freshmen are able to prove it to him, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he went their direction, relatively heavily.
And you mentioned Anthony Watkins was close to being a 1,000-yard rusher. He was only 111 yards shy of that in 2023, coming off of a slow start. Do you think we see a 1,000-yard rusher out of Tulsa this year?
Yeah, I think so. I think if Watkins is healthy, he certainly seems like a guy who should be able to run for 1,000 yards, considering how much Kevin Wilson will look to establish the run. And, the offensive line obviously has some questions, but that's not too high a bar for a guy who 3 years ago, averaged 7.4 yards per carry, and just last year, nearly 900 yards rushing. If Watkins is healthy, I think he's a 1,000-yard guy. And if Watkins isn't and Jackson gets the bulk of the carries for most of the year, that's a guy who I could see squeezing out, roughly 1,000. With a Kevin Wilson offense, they're going to run a lot of plays and they're going to commit to the run each and every week as much as they possibly can until you absolutely prove that you can stop it. And so, yeah, I would expect a 1,000-yard rusher most seasons if Kevin Wilson's the guy calling the plays.
Moving over to the passing game, Tulsa saw 3 of their top 4 receivers from 2023 enter the transfer portal. However, they do return the leading receiver in Camden Benjamin and his 47 receptions for 727 yards and a team-leading 6 touchdowns. How did the wide receivers look in the spring?
It was tough to say. There were, I think, 2 open practice viewings for me. Not everybody was healthy. One thing you would certainly say is that transfer from UTEP, Jeremiah Ballard, is going to be a guy that they're relying on. Is certainly a guy who you could see as sort of the number 1 big-bodied receiver option. 6'3", good body control, just a polished receiver who I think the numbers were pretty good at UTEP last year, right? Like 600 or 700 yards, something like that. So a guy who at a comparable level has been relied upon. And I think he's just a plug and play guy. You can expect Jeremiah Ballard to be competing for, top receiver status. And then the same goes for Cam Benjamin, who he really seemed to be on the same page with Kirk Francis late in the season and cooked that Tulane secondary, which was one of the best in the American repeatedly. He was really good down the stretch, and he's a guy who I think they have a lot of slot receiver types, and some of these guys maybe they're going to play at other positions, but like Zion Steptoe, who comes in from Purdue, he may be able to play one of those other receiver positions, but he's got the builds, the look of a slot guy. And then Braylon Presley, who was a former Gatorade Oklahoma Player of the Year at Bixby, which is kind of the rolling high school power here in the Tulsa area right now, a guy who started his career at Oklahoma State, now is transferred to OSU. He's a little bitty guy, but we've seen how dynamic he can be. And when it clicks for him, people expect big things from him, but he's definitely a slot kind of guy. Grayson Tempest, another local kid who came from Union. They've got a lot of slot guys, but without question, Cam Benjamin is number 1 in that group. And that showed in what I was able to see in the spring as well. He's polished. The footwork is great. The way he runs his routes, to me, really, really good. The hands are good. He's proven it, against a team as tough and physical as Tulane. Ballard and Benjamin are where you start and you feel pretty good about receiver. If either of those guys get hurt, I think the whole thing looks very different. But then they've got, some other guys who are intriguing. I don't think I talked about that 2024 recruiting class, which was as good as maybe TU has ever brought in. And the position they recruited the very best was wide receiver, where you have 5 guys who were recruited by other comparable schools or even bigger. The guy who popped in the spring comes from, I believe, Illinois, Corey Smith. He's 6'1", 170, made a couple of plays in that spring showcase. I think really was kind of running with the starters at that time. I don't know if that's indicative of exactly where it's going to be come August, but he certainly showed you some things. But then Joshua Smith, Alex Green, Joseph Williams, Jacob Emmers, all of those guys were relatively highly recruited. And so TU's got a lot of bodies, and they really just need 1 or 2 of those guys to pop. I think 1 or 2 of the freshmen definitely will make an impact. I think that Cam Benjamin and Jeremiah Ballard are guys you can, I think, rely on. Like they'll be 1, 2 in some order, in my opinion. Zion's step toe I haven't seen enough of, but coming from Purdue, it's certainly if he was good enough to be recruited by a Big Ten school, you assume that he's got the talent to make an impact if he's able to get up to speed. And then some of those other guys, Braylon Presley, Grayson Tempest, both made plays in the spring showcase. And so it's not a position that you feel is like absolutely a strength, but it is one that I'm a little bit bullish on. I think that things will develop, especially with Kevin Wilson calling the plays. I think receiver will end up being better than it was a year ago. Some of those guys who went out the door and ended up at pretty good places, North Texas or Marshall, they were good ball players, but I think that this group on the whole should be even better than what they had last year. Should definitely be better than what they had last year.
In one of those true freshmen, I'm kind of curious to hear more about Alex Green. 2023, he had 102 receptions for 2,058 yards and 19 touchdowns for Hutto, Texas. Like, wow.
Yeah. No, and that's the thing. TU landed more kids, and not that Green falls into this, but TU landed more kids in the Dallas Morning News top 100 than any school in the country. They really did a fantastic job recruiting the state of Texas. And look, when you're playing at that level and putting up numbers like that, he's a speedster. You put on the tape and you love what you see. Because of the size, I never expect a kid like that to pop right away, but it's possible. And like I said, I think 1 or 2 of these freshmen will be relied upon heavily and will kind of make himself a bit of a star as soon as this year. That just wouldn't surprise me. I think the opportunity is there. And then I think in total, the talent is there. Like I said, I'm pretty bullish on the receiver position for TU until proven otherwise. I don't mind admitting when I'm wrong, but I like what I saw in the spring.
Tulsa returns tight end Luke McGarry. If you were to describe the tight end usage for this offense to somebody who's never caught a game, how would you describe it?
Well, it's going to go up. Kevin Wilson loves McGarry and said that from almost the first time he laid eyes on him last year. My understanding is in the weight room, he is an animal and came in as a freshman and beat the totals of a lot of guys that were older than him. He goes, I think, 6'3", 250 roughly, and caught 3 touchdowns last year. The offense never could get out of second gear for a good part of the season. That hurts tight end play. But I see it as a position that's ascending. No doubt those guys got more looks from Kirk Francis in the 2 practice viewings I saw this spring than what they did last year. And it wasn't just McGarry or Ethan Hall, who's a senior and has been around and played some, in the Philip Montgomery offense. What he did almost looked as much like fullback as tight end. But he's a guy who, as a blocker, he's a bit of an animal. But he'll surprise you with his ability to catch passes. Certain routes. He's not McGarry. He's not polished in that way, not as long. But he's a guy who can get the job done. Connor Vaughn is a guy who I don't remember hearing his name at all last year, and he popped a couple of times to me in the spring with passes downfield. Francis was able to hit him. So there's another kid, I believe, from the Dallas area, 6'3", 250-ish. And that doesn't even get to Jackson Ford, who might have been as good as they brought in. It's certainly at the tight end position, but I mean for the entire class. Kid who won a state championship there in the state of Texas and was recruited by some bigger schools as well. So they've got, I think, a lot to work with at the tight end position. I think that it's an ascending position for TU, one that Kevin Wilson feels really good about the position, but that does all start with Luke McGarry, who I think is certainly poised to break out and do a whole lot more than what he did 1 year ago as a true freshman.
Moving over to the offensive line, they lose 5 offensive linemen to graduation. Those 5 guys made up about 61% of the snaps taken in 2023. They also lost Jeremy Jones over to Marshall. They bring back some left side of the line in Ray Burnett and Walter Youngbear, and also right guard Tawatau Leo Marks. How will they look to fill those losses they had along the offensive line?
Yeah, tackles, big question, maybe as big a question as there is on this team. They do like what's inside as long as those guys all stay healthy, Youngbear, Burnett, and Marks. They all looked pretty solid to me in the spring. And generally speaking, just, I am no expert in offensive line play. Don't mind admitting that. So what I'm looking for is just sort of generally, are you able to come off the ball and move it forward some in the running game? Are you able to keep the quarterback relatively clean? And there was enough of that in the spring for me to feel like, okay, this isn't necessarily going to be a disaster. That said, there is still a lot of work to do. And I think the tackle position is interesting. They were starting, and, I don't know if he's sort of the starter going into August. I assume all of these guys are going to have to, work this out. But a kid by the name of Caden Stanton from a town called Beggs, which is here in what we call Green Country, basically the Tulsa area. I believe started his career at New Mexico State. It is now transferred back. So 1 year in college, still a redshirt freshman, and he was taking just about all the first-team reps that I saw in the 2 spring practices, and that would have been at right tackle. So he's in the mix, and I don't know enough, to other than he was a local kid that was a big-bodied guy, and we knew that he was going to New Mexico State and thought of him as about that level of guy. Maybe he's ready to blossom and be what Tulsa needs at right tackle. Bennett Ringleb is another local kid from Union High School, which is a power here, and he was getting the first-team reps at left tackle. And then there are, a couple other guys who were in the mix, Jacob Waller and Jack Tanner. I think tackle is certainly a concern. That's not to say that Kevin Wilson doesn't have a plan, not to say that Coach Fry isn't able to coach these guys up and turn them into a pretty good unit by the time the season starts. But it's not ideal. It's not optimal when you've got the 2 positions that, are most important in terms of keeping your quarterback clean, relying on guys that young and that inexperienced. So we'll see, they'll throw it into a bag. I think Kevin Wilson coaches offensive line about as good as anybody. He took some guys that had never produced last year, and Darrell Simpson ended up being a guy who, gets invited to an NFL camp. So I have a lot of faith in Kevin Wilson's ability to coach offensive line, even though that's not his position exactly, but he's got a hand in it. And wouldn't be surprised if any of these guys step forward, but they do feel good about what's up front there at the 2 guard positions and center.
Who is it that you think is going to step up into that center position? Is that Marks or? Yeah,
I think Marks seems like the guy to me. Took just about every first-team rep I saw, and really, I thought he's, like, again, not an expert in offensive line play, but seemed to be a guy who held the point of attack pretty well, not just in the scrimmage action, but when they were doing kind of one-on-one pass rush stuff. He was a guy who wasn't beaten very much at all. So I do think Marks is probably the guy at center, and they feel pretty good about it.
All right, Caden, if you had to pick a offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
Well, Jeremiah Ballard, for sure, simply because he's new here. Now, maybe that doesn't count because of what he did at UTEP, but I do think he's going to be, if I had to guess who was going to be the leading receiver at the end of the year, I'd say Jeremiah Ballard. Because he wasn't here last year, I'd say that probably qualifies. Luke McGarry, if you're talking about a homegrown guy, the hype for him is huge. It was huge last year, and he did catch 3 touchdown passes, but I think they're just going to find a way to get it in his hands quite a bit. So I could see him being a breakout guy. And if you're talking about a freshman, Corey Smith, who, looked pretty good in the spring at wide receiver, or Byron Ellison. I like what I saw from Byron Ellison. Granted, it's a long year. He was an early enrollee who impressed, in his first couple of months, or at least on a couple of Saturdays where I got to watch. So there's a lot that has to be done. But at the running back position, you can usually see it. Even if you're a bit of a layman, you can tell when a guy's got juice that other guys just don't have. And I think he does have something that's a little special in that running back room.
Moving over to the defensive side of the ball, let's talk about the guys up front along that defensive line. They lose their leading sack getter from 2023 and second-team Group of 5 All-American and Ben Kopinski to graduation, along with Joseph Anderson and Everett Rogers, who went to Houston. Not all is lost, as they do return Owen Ostrowski and talented freshman Von Troy Malone and others. What did Tulsa do to shore up that defensive line in the spring?
Yeah. Well, just like the tackle positions are a concern on offense, the defensive tackle positions are a concern on defense. I think they really like what they have at defensive end. Kopinski was fantastic last year, and you would have loved to have him for another year. He was such a team-first guy who had an incredible motor, almost never came off the field. He was fantastic. But I do love what they have at defensive end. That starts with Owen Ostrowski, who in roughly 8 games last year had about 10 tackles for loss. He was really good. When he was healthy, he was without question a starter. His dad was an All-American, Jerry Ostrowski, and then played 10 years in the NFL, offensive lineman. Owen is a kid who we all, if you cover high school football in this area, watched closely, knew how good he was, hated that TU was so late in offering him. And when they finally did, all of us said, thank you. Right? This kid deserves to play here, and he has done nothing but hit the ground running and prove that to be exactly right. Injuries have been an issue. It was multiple different minor injuries last year, and there was another one in the spring, I believe his thumb. He's got to stay healthy. If he stays healthy, he's going to be really good, have all the confidence in the world in him. Von Troy Malone is the guy with the most bend. That's sort of obvious the first time you watch these guys do any sort of pass rush drills. Really bright future. It did have, I think, more than 20 tackles last year and flashed some, but he's a breakout guy. I assume you'll ask me at some point about my defensive breakout guy. Von Troy Malone is definitely in the mix for that. Like I say, he's the guy coming off the edge with the bend that's sort of prototypical. But then, the third guy who you're pretty excited about coming off the edge is Miles Jackson, who was a transfer, I believe, from Indiana. Once again, one of those guys who was recruited, by a Big Ten school, and just watching him move around in the spring showcase, like you get it. So those 3 guys trying to get after the passer, like that's about as good as TU can hope for the most. In the 16 years I've been covering TU, like at that position, that's what you want it to look like. But defensive tackle is, I have no idea. There were guys who were injured in the spring, and so I think it was R.J. Jackson, who's an Oklahoma kid, and Ty Newhouse, who were starting in that spring showcase, but I don't necessarily know that they're the guys. Tyler Rich is a kid from Owasso, which is another area school, so we've seen him. Justin Lorenz is a guy who's been around a little bit, certainly flashed in the spring showcase. He wears number 94, and he again is a defensive end who can maybe come inside, but it's tough to say. That is a work in progress. They don't have ideal size or depth, but that's not to say that there aren't some guys who are promising, and it just didn't show itself necessarily in that spring showcase. And that said, they gave up a couple of long runs, but for the most part, the defensive line did a pretty good job in the practices I was able to see. The offense wasn't just picking up first downs left and right. They would make a play here or there. But for the most part, the defense probably, you could say, won the scrimmages that I saw. And obviously, you're not doing that if the guys in the middle of your defensive line aren't doing the job to some extent. And so I think that they have, a couple of guys that they feel have some real promise potentially. But the strength on the defensive line is definitely the guys who are rushing the passer. The beef in the middle is a little bit of a question mark for me.
The linebacking group was hit hard between graduation and the portal. They lost Julian Simon to UConn, Dorian Hopkins to UTEP, Mitchell Culkin, and Colton Smith to graduation. Those 4 accounted for about 22% of all the defensive tackles in 2023. What did Tulsa do to address those losses? Well,
transfers out, transfers in. They did a pretty good job landing a couple of local kids who actually played together and helped Broken Arrow. I've shouted out, I think, almost every big-time high school we've got here in the Tulsa area. And that's to Kevin Wilson's credit, because a lot of these kids were not recruited by Philip Montgomery, but they've been brought back in the fold via transfer by Kevin Wilson. And so Gavin Potter, who started his college career at Kansas and then Arkansas State for a year, he'll be in the mix at linebacker. Zach Marchicelli, who was at TCU, really liked the way he moves, fluid athlete, got the start, if you want to call it that, in the spring showcase. I thought moved around pretty well. Elijah Wilson, a kid from Duncanville, redshirt freshman. He was alongside Marchicelli as sort of the other linebacking starter. And I like the way he moved and some of the plays he made. Chris Thompson Jr., who transfers in from USC, didn't flash a lot in the viewings that I had, but certainly a guy who, based on, having been recruited by Auburn and then USC, is a guy who I think certainly has the size, speed, talent that you want. So I think they're going to be okay. Eli McWilliams is another one of our local kids who forced a fumble in that spring showcase, kind of a bigger kid who I think you could also see them playing a jack position and coming off the edge. So they've got enough bodies. And I don't think that the linebacker play was outstanding enough last year that's a huge concern. They've got several guys who have played at a higher level than the American Athletic Conference, and they weren't guys necessarily who were incredibly productive. You don't expect all of those guys to hit, but you expect a couple. And the way defenses play these days, really you almost never have more than 2 linebackers on the field anyway, and so I don't see depth as just a huge concern. If you felt like you had to play 3 linebackers down in, down out, I think getting to 6 or 7 that you felt good about might be a problem, but I don't think that getting to 4 or 5 that you feel pretty good about is going to be a problem.
So the defensive backfield loses a big-time contributor and leading tackler, Kendarin Ray, who counted for about 15% of all Tulsa tackles in 2023. They also lose Jace Oliver to TCU. However, they do return Dane Hodge and Tyree Carlisle, among others. How did the defensive backfield look in the spring?
Not bad. I would say that they played pretty conservatively. It seemed like they were blitzing linebackers a lot and then, trying to keep defensive backs, behind everything and not get beat deep. So a couple guys came up and made plays. One of them, DeMarco Jones, who is a Tulsa area kid who started his college career at Oklahoma State, came back. We didn't see him flash last year. To see him flash a couple times in the spring was nice. But the guys you feel really good about because they've played a fair amount and they've got kind of the either length or flat out speed that you want, Tyree Carlisle, Reggie Ellis, Kewan Parker. Those are guys who played a fair amount last year, who have played in the past, guys that I feel like, they trust. And then the guy that gets you excited is CJ Turner. We'll see if he's the guy who steps in and starts for Kendarin Ray at that particular safety position, or how long it'll take him to maybe become a leader there. But that was one of those guys who was about as highly recruited as TU is able to land out of Arkansas, I believe. And just watching him move around, like it's different. On the flip side of that, a guy who looks completely ordinary until he comes up and hits you and makes a play or two is Dane Hodge, a guy who made a lot of plays last year. And I don't know that there's anybody in the defensive backfield that they trust more than that guy. And he'll come up and play, kind of a rover, half linebacker type. He's a little guy, but he's got a nose for the ball. And without question, they trust him. So I think there's a nice mix of guys who have kind of top end athleticism for this level, TU, and that would be some of the Carlisle and Ellis and Turner. And then some guys who are just kind of gamers who you feel like you can count on. So that position is a work in progress too. I'm not going to tell you it's not. You don't lose Kendarin Ray. You don't lose Jace Oliver and just replace him like that. I am not saying that. But I think they feel like they have the bodies in place to get close. And especially in year 2 under Chris Polizzi, this defense should, on the whole, probably be better than it was last year. And maybe not to start the year. Maybe it takes a little while. But there's greater depth. And then obviously, I think greater trust in the coaching staff and understanding in what they're asking you to do. And those are probably things that are going to serve this defense well.
All right, Caden, you guessed it. I was going to ask you a little bit later. That time is now. If you had to pick a defensive player to have that breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
Yeah, I'll say Vontroy Malone, even though he did a pretty nice job, certainly in the amount of playing time he had last year. But you watch this kid just in drills, doesn't take a rocket scientist. When a kid can come off the edge with that kind of bend, usually that translates. So I expect Malone to have a really nice year. I mentioned Turner in the backfield. And then any of those linebacker transfers, Marchicelli, Potter, Thompson Jr., wouldn't be surprised if any of those guys pop and become one of the better players on this defense. But I'll go Vontroy Malone. Excited to see him play.
So now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you feel is the most concerning?
Certainly the offensive tackle position concerns me, and the defensive tackle position. Those two more than any other. and those are positions that need to be good. And, because those positions are not exactly going against each other, but the lines are going against each other in the spring, it can be hard for me to know exactly what I'm looking at. I thought that both did a relatively nice job. Nobody dominated, certainly, in that matchup. But if both lines are not where you want it to be, you can kind of be fooled, if you don't know exactly what you're looking at in some of these spring practices. And so I'm kind of putting a pin in that, right? Like I wanted to, I have my opinions. I came away feeling like it looked better than I thought it would on both lines. But if we get into the opener, and you're dealing with an FCS level team that's either getting after your quarterback or able to run the ball down your throat, I reserve the right to change my opinion completely and say these lines are not good enough. And this season's going to be one heck of a tough uphill climb for Kevin Wilson.
Now that, spring practice and the transfer portal is kind of closed in terms of people entering, but you can still, go shopping, if you will. Is there any positions in particular you think they might be looking at in the portal?
Yeah, I think it would be those two. And the bummer of it is, apparently, to get a defensive tackle, you need huge money in this day and age. We've seen that play out here just the last few weeks, and some of it here in the state of Oklahoma down there in Norman. And offensive linemen, for whatever reason, and maybe especially offensive tackles, good ones just don't make it into the portal. People got excited a couple weeks ago because a kid from UCLA who started at one of the tackle positions made it in. And then I heard that PFF had him like dead last in the country. It's like, you can't get better easily at those positions, even for a University of Tulsa, right? And so they're going to have to make do. Like, they're going to have to coach those guys up and trust their recruiting, and maybe play a freshman like Caden Stanton at right tackle. You just rely on some guys who are young and hope that it works out. I think that's just the situation they're going to be in along the lines here to start the year.
So what would you say the main strength of this team is going into 2024?
Yeah, that's a fun question. Because I hate to highlight any one position. Like, I love the defensive ends, but because the defensive tackles are such a question mark, I'm like, I'm certainly not going to say defensive line as a whole. I like what they have in a lot of these rooms. I like what they have at wide receiver, but it's nowhere near proven enough. I like what they have at running back, but good running backs are, I don't want to say a dime or a dozen, but this room nobody's going to go win a Heisman Trophy. I think the strength of this team, in my estimation at this moment, is that I think it's a really good coaching staff. That, granted, the results were not really good 1 year ago, but man, Kevin Wilson, if you go back to, let's say, 2000, I don't think that there's an offensive play caller in college football who's been responsible for more yards gained, more points scored. Like, what this guy has done is, pretty much beyond reproach in terms of offensive football. And I happen to think the job he did at Indiana as a head coach was really, really good. And by the way, year one wasn't great. So I have faith in him, and I think that he's done a nice job hiring the staff that he's hired. And they've recruited so well. It's not a small thing to bring in the best class you've brought in 20 years. And the reason for that, I guess I can bring that up now. Kevin Wilson will tell you, because of the transfer portal and because so many of the bigger schools are looking to fill needs with more experienced players from the portal, there are high school guys that a University of Tulsa could not get in on in the past who might have ended up playing in the Big 12, who now a school like Tulsa is their best option. And so they hit that hard. They went kind of old school with the recruiting approach. They don't have a lot to offer in terms of NIL, but they do have a spot to offer a kid who might have been able to play in the Big 12 in years past, but just doesn't get that look anymore. And so the strength of this team, in my mind, is a good coaching staff that is now in year two and getting better, with a really good recruiting class behind it, and a staff that I think has proven itself capable of recruiting really well. And now you've got good numbers in the freshman and sophomore classes, much better than I think what we've seen probably in the last couple of years, or the 3 or 4 years at the University of Tulsa. I think that you've got good talent, better than Tulsa is used to as a whole in those young classes. That's kind of the strength now. And people, TU fans, may not want to hear that for 2024, because I don't expect this team to go 8-4, 9-3. but I think they're building something. And so to me, the strength of this team is a coaching staff that I have some faith in, and some recruiting and some talent in those younger classes that can be built upon. Hopefully they can keep some of those guys, right? I mean, anybody who pops can hop in the portal like that. But I think right now that's the strength of this team, that it's trending up.
You know, you touched on this a little bit in regards to NIL and transfer portal in general, but does Tulsa have a collective, and is it something that's relatively new to them, or is it pretty well established?
Yeah, not to speak of. There's probably some. What they do, according to Kevin Wilson, they have money set aside that in the past the university was pocketing, but I think cost of scholarship maybe is the term. So roughly 10 or 12 grand that becomes, I say that, let's assume I'm in the ballpark, that becomes available to kids if they meet certain criteria. So if you make the grades, you get some money. And, I mean, that's not a bad thing for a kid at this level. Certainly there are American Conference schools paying a lot more. Memphis, for instance, which
Memphis with the FedEx money.
Yes, exactly. And so Tulsa is playing in a very different ball game than those guys are. But that's what they've been able to come up with, as I understand it, and that's according to Kevin Wilson. There's several $1,000s available to kids who do the right things. Maybe that's only made available at the end of the semester. I'm not exactly sure how often maybe those payments get made. And there may be kids who get offered things. If they're, for instance, AJ Green was a backup to Rocket Sanders at Arkansas for the last 3 years, ran for about 1,000 yards as a backup. He committed to TU, and I know that there was money offered just from, sort of back channels, things I heard. And that could have been outside of that money that we're talking about. So there could be in special instances, maybe at the quarterback position. I don't know. And maybe it's nobody. Maybe that's all it is. You got to make the grades and do a couple other community things, and then you get some money at the end. But that's my understanding, and they do it the old school way. I can tell you for certain. Kevin Wilson took a lot of pride in what they were able to bring in December and then February, and felt like his coaches hit the trail in an old school way, built relationships, and went after kids that are maybe a notch above what the University of Tulsa has often brought in, because of what I mentioned earlier, because of the portal. Some of these bigger schools are not on these kids. And if those kids come in, work hard, and do the right things, there's some money available for them, is my understanding.
Now in the G5 world with the transfer portal and whatnot, it kind of seems that more and more the demands of the head coach are turning into more of a general manager type role. They got to recruit your incoming freshmen, your transfer portal, player retention, fundraising, and then they're becoming less and less the X's and O's type role. Do you see that there with Kevin Wilson at Tulsa?
I think he's got some additional headaches, but I think everything you just said, you get to be at the University of Tulsa more than you do maybe any other school in the country. He gets to be an old school coach, focused on the X's and O's, or focused on building relationships and recruiting, as opposed to attempting to meet a dollar amount. If they've got a general manager, that would be news to me. In fact, I know they don't. I see college football heading that way. It's incredibly interesting to me. I'm a lifelong Notre Dame fan. I see some of the moves they make, and a lot of it seems like it's for the good, right? I mean, seems to me like you've got some really smart, talented people who are only adding resources and making themselves available to help these kids. I know that with a number of schools I pay attention to, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Oklahoma State, it seems to me like kids get in trouble less. It seems like kids have academic issues less. And I think a lot of that has to do with the beefing up of these staffs, at the Power 4 level. TU's playing a different ball game. And for Tulsa to have made up the ground it has in the classroom just since Kevin Wilson got here, the GPA going up every single semester, I know that's something he's really proud of, and I think that's something they are having to do with just good old-fashioned hard work. They don't have the same staff size. They can't do it the way he did it at Ohio State. but they feel like they're building this thing the right way, and that there is, under Philip Montgomery, I love the guy, but they were bottom 20 or 30 in the country every single year when it came to penalties. Like, TU wants to be different than that. They want to field a team that plays hard and plays smart, and they want to build this thing from the ground up. And of course, when you have a running back run for 1,200 yards as a freshman or sophomore, he's going to get offered by one of those big schools, offered a bunch of money, and you're probably not going to keep him. But if you can bring in more talented kids than you ever have, and you can just keep some of them, a good number of them, I think they feel like TU can play some pretty good ball here in the near future.
So the 2024 season's over, the dust has settled, and you're looking back upon it. What has to happen for you to say this season was a success?
Well, I've said in the past, for the University of Tulsa, any season that ends in a bowl game is a success, full stop. This is the smallest school in the country. They face challenges that other programs don't face every single year, and that even goes for, a handful of teams in the American who are playing a different ball game. We just mentioned Memphis. 6 wins, without question, would be a success for this program. I think they could see this as a successful season, even if they end up outside a bowl game, but the team just plays better ball. If you look at, I love FEI or F plus or SP plus, looking at some of the advanced numbers, and I want to say that at least with regard to F plus, last year's TU team was like 119 in the country. I think that's the worst in the 16 years I've been here, even worse than Bill Blankenship's worst team, and things had sort of bottomed out, or Philip Montgomery. He had a team that went 2-10 at one time. If they make significant improvement and jump into the top 80, even if it's just 4 or 5 wins, I would consider that steps in the right direction. And I certainly would not be, Kevin Wilson's on the hot seat here. This was a true rebuild, and the way he's decided to go about it made it even more of a rebuild, because he's kind of doing it the old-fashioned way. So if this team just plays better ball, offense and defense, I would consider it a successful season. But a bowl game is what you want, and if they can find a way to win 6 or more, look, it's possible, right? I mean, who knows what Laga, the quarterback from Utah State, is capable of? If you've got a quarterback who's wheeling and dealing with Kevin Wilson calling the plays, maybe it's going to be a heck of a year at 11th and Harvard. But to me, if they can take that next step and become a 500 team and make it to a bowl game, without question, that's successful.
All right, Caden, we've talked offense to defense. We've talked, Kevin Wilson. Is there anything that you think we should know that we missed about this 2024 Tulsa Golden Hurricanes football team?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like I've been talking for a very long time. I can't imagine there's almost anything in my brain that I still have to offer. But I would just say, going back to something I just said a moment ago, if they get the quarterback position right, a lot of other things are going to fall into place. And I think that there's probably more talent on hand in this program, albeit often young, more talent than people probably know, more talent than the 119 ranking in F plus would tell you. So I'm not bullish on this team just like shocking the world, but I am bullish on improvement. Like I think they've got the right coach. I think he's building it the right way. I think it will take time. But I think TU's future is relatively bright.
Well, thank you again, Caden, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. We greatly appreciate it.
Fellas, my pleasure, and God bless you for giving the G5 some love. That's just a really, really cool thing. Can I ask you guys a question before we go?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe you've talked about this at length. Maybe you never have. Obviously, the G5 is going to see what happens with a 12-team playoff, maybe if it goes to 14, this year, next, whatever. But I think we all assume that the Power Four are going to try and squeeze them out, or especially those two at the top, SEC, Big Ten. If they can find a way to keep more money for themselves and get rid of that spot that's promised to the G5, I think they're going to do it sooner than later. Would you personally like to see the G5 come up with its own playoff? And that's assuming they have to. I'm not saying
if they have to do it, sure. Yeah. They don't have a choice. I like the underdog story, right? I mean, kind of like I think that's what drives March Madness and college football. But I do, or the realist in me tells me it's inevitable that it's going to happen. I don't know, like as a fan and alumni of a G5 school, I don't know, like I see and I can be excited for both sides. I like that they have the opportunity to win what I would call like a true national championship, even though the odds are heavily stacked against them. But just I don't know. When Old Dominion moved up from FCS to FBS, I was at that point in time, I was probably a little irritated because I felt like we had a great shot at winning an FCS national championship,
Sure.
and we we only spent I think 4 years in the FCS, and so I was disappointed that we never really got the opportunity. I mean, we made the playoffs, but I felt like we had 2 more years with Taylor Heineke. We were probably going to make it to a championship game, and so I was definitely disappointed when we moved up and did get the opportunity. So I see both sides of the argument, I guess.
My big thing is if there's got to be, you have to do a tournament and it's G5 only, as long as private equities are not involved at all, then that's probably the best case scenario. Because as soon as there's talk about private equities getting involved, which I think would be, a death to the G5 because they're just in it for the money. And as soon as they have squeezed out everything that they can from the G5 and there's no more money to be made, they will scrap it for parts, take what they want, maybe, and, take those guys up to the P4 or whatever, and then everything else will be gone. So if they have to do it, as long as private equities are not involved, I'll be okay.
Yep, totally agree. I think that time is coming. I like the idea of doing it just like the FCS guys do, where it's a 10-game regular season schedule. You play that playoff early, and you better believe I would watch the heck out of it. I mean, I don't know what the numbers would be. Obviously, it would be way smaller than what the big boy playoff would get, but I would just delight in it. So I understand why that's not the push yet. I don't think it should be the push yet, but I think that's where we're going to end up. And when we end up there, I'm not going to apologize for loving the G5 playoff. I think it'll be cool.
I mean, any extra football is great football. I guess I'll have another follow-up question for you, Caden. If there's, one of the arguments is that, let's just say it's number 1 Tulsa versus number 2 JMU. Tune in, Friday night or, Saturday afternoon to that. Do you think because they would be in their own, hub or conferences there that you would generate buzz by having a number 1 versus number 2 just at a different level?
Boy, I don't know. It's so hard for me, especially because Tulsa is a name I hear and I follow them all the time. You throw James Madison in. How excited would the casual fan be for Tulsa and James Madison? This would be a playoff for football junkies, without question.
Yeah.
But I would love to look at the bowl game numbers featuring only G5 schools over the last 10 or 15 years. That's probably what we're talking about, right? Maybe there would be an uptick for the games at the very end to decide a championship. But, I mean, that's what we're talking about. And the point there is that's still better than what ESPN can do with any NBA game in the month of December, any college basketball matchup they come up with in the month of December. People will dunk on the ratings and act like this is such a JV thing, and to some extent it is. But it would still, in my mind, be worth it to ESPN as long as you schedule it at a time that's completely separate from what the big boys are doing. So you got to change your regular season, probably start sooner and play fewer games, and then but maybe it's impossible. Maybe, the more I think about that, because of the way the college football season is going to be with a 12 or 14 playoff, they're going to go right into it. And maybe there's just no way to even get the kind of numbers you get with minor bowl games. But
it's interesting, though, that you talk about that doing the starting sooner, because there are people like us that is creating content all year round. Football's 12 months a year, and we are dying for we're about 100 days out or so from football being back. If you give us NCAA football 3 weeks sooner than the week 0,
Thank you.
and you can capitalize on those 3 weeks, that
Yep.
that's a model to look at.
Yep. In August, that's brutal, but make all of those games night games, and you better believe I'll be watching it.
Absolutely. Well, hey, thanks again for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. If you are watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you are listening to us in podcast form, please leave a rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until next time, we are the G5 Hive.